Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's been an absolutely delightful conference thus far, and I know that this time of day is a unique moment for attention. And so I will do my best to be as lively as possible while not stepping away from the mic. So today, I'm going to be giving a talk that brings together two fields, literature and the neuroscience of reading, to discuss a central problem in both the humanities and the sciences, attention. I'll be talking about two things in particular. So one, what captures our attention when we read a book? And two, what unique styles of focus can we bring to a book based on our training in the humanities, particularly our training in literature? So most of the time, at least in theory, I spend my life studying 18th century literature, working in particular on a book on the history of distraction and what people 200 years ago thought about things like attention span, mind wandering, divided attention, multitasking. But in my spare time, today I'll be discussing two experiments I've been working on simultaneously. One, an fMRI of people reading Jane Austen with different levels of attention. And if there's time, which I'm not sure there will be, a new study that we're developing on poetry, attention, and aesthetic pleasure in collaboration with Gabby Starr, who you heard earlier, at NYU. It's currently in behavioral stages. So neither of these experiments, I should say, is 100% done. The first one because the data analysis is so complicated, and the second because we're just getting going with our behavioral pilot. So the point here, I'd like to say, is not the results. We're not done. Instead, since I'm the PI in English, with a co-PI in neuroscience and collaborators in radiology, neuroscience, computer science, and beyond, my goal is to demonstrate that there's a way for literary scholars, 18th century or no, to enter into productive dialogue with cognitive science, not by raw importing its technologies, simply quote unquote applying its insights, or even looking to neuroscience for answers. Why humanities? But in fact, shaping its studies, reshaping its methods, and producing a more reciprocal conversation about reading in the mind, one that produces authentically interdisciplinary research that can advance both fields. So our Austen study explores the cognitive dynamics of two complex styles of attention we can bring to a book, close reading and pleasure reading. And here, it's a chapter of Mansfield Park. So for anyone who's not in English, pleasure reading, or more obviously relaxed style of focus, lets us become, we believe, right, more immersed in a story. We've heard this word come up a lot at this conference. Or as Suzanne put it yesterday, lost in a good book. If we like the book, that is. Close reading, as most of us know, asks us instead to shift attention to look at a novel's structure, paying attention to and analyzing key elements like plot, characterization, setting, voice, metaphor, etc., that in fact give a novel its very power and depth to immerse us in the first place. And I think we all know this, and I put up a quote here from Elaine Showalter, but comparing these lets us analyze one of the crucial elements that is taught in literary and humanities classrooms across the country. And so really giving us an opportunity to begin to dig into its cognitive complexity. So I'll just begin by telling you a little bit about the experimental technologies that we're using. So the first that we're using, fMRI, gives a dynamic picture of blood flow to the brain. Basically, and I don't know how much people need this background or not, so I'm gonna go for it. Basically, where neurons which need oxygenation are firing and when. We're also one of the first few groups that's been able to use fMRI-compatible eye tracking in the neuroscience of reading, which lets us see how people's eyes are moving as they read, the pattern of saccades, in other words, the small micro jumps the eyes are making as they go, and moments where readers speed up, slow down, or reread, mapping thus points of interest and parts where people, as you might be right now, zone out. Since our goal was to investigate the value and complexity of literary attention, it was important to find a population that we knew could do both of these things incredibly well. Both close reading and pleasure reading, and comically, professors were out. That's because, as I discovered in our pilot, many of us have forgotten entirely how to read for pleasure. Suzanne, you could totally still stay in. But literary PhDs, however, were perfect. And we brought together a group of almost 30 in the sum between the pilot and the experiment from Stanford, Berkeley, and San Jose State for the two together. So I actually want to do something that's, I think, unusual. I don't think many people walk you through a study, but I'm going to. I'm going to take you through it step by step. So here's what happens. A literary PhD comes into the lab and begins reading Mansfield Park, and they read the entire first chapter outside of the scanner for pleasure. And we get a time. We do that for two reasons. They can get a sense of how fast they read normally when reading for pleasure, and then they also can get used to Jane Austen's style. And they don't always wear those cardigans. Then the student goes into the MRI and they move through the entire second chapter, paragraph by paragraph, actually, moving at their own speed as we track blood flow, right, changes of blood flow in the brain, eye movements, and changes in heart rate and respiration. And they can take as long as they want to move ahead, but I'll take you through a little faster. Again, this is another example. If you can see how happy everyone is, and all these women in science. So clearly the person who's holding the button, she's reading the text through a mirror that's above her eyes. It projects to the back. And so I'm going to take you through it as though you can all imagine yourselves, wrapped in all these things, pushing buttons. And you won't be able to do it at your own speed, but just give you a sense. Ready? So this is an example of what would be the instructions for pleasure reading. And they would push the button to move through at their own pace. Be 8 of these in a row. And then after this, they would switch to close reading. And there would be 8 in a row of these. And at the end, they got out and they wrote a literary essay outside the scanner without being able to look back at the text. And they actually went through 3 different surveys, which we can come back to, but you'll see some of the familiar faces. So to the first surprise. Oops, I'm giving away the surprise. So data analysis is still in progress, as I said, so some context will help explain why these early findings have been so intriguing. When I first talked to neuroscientists about this work, everyone expected to see really, really subtle differences in brain activity. And that makes sense. After all, everyone was reading the same thing, Jane Austen, just reading it in 2 different ways. And based on this, we almost did a test where we zoomed in on just the attention regions, and largely in the prefrontal cortex, just so we'd have a chance of seeing it. Well, it turns out, thank goodness, we didn't. Since the experiment had never been done before, we decided to go ahead and get whole brain images. And it's early, but the biggest surprise so far has been this. If I can get to the next page. So though one might have expected to see, pleasure centers activating for the more relaxed style of reading, or regions associated with work, cognitive load, or attention, perhaps some nervousness, anxiety, work for literary analysis, what we saw, at least in these early analyses, was something else entirely. And so what caught our attention here, this is early data analysis from FSL, was how much the whole brain seemed to be transforming for each subject and moving between close reading and pleasure reading, with close reading demonstrating almost global activations across brain regions, areas reaching far beyond those traditionally associated with attention and executive functions in neuroscience. And for those less familiar with fMRI, does anyone want me to say more about the red, like what these things indicate? Is everybody pretty comfortable? Yeah? No? We're all good. All right, cool. Onwards. And so, if so, obviously, we have these widespread, unbelievably unexpected global activations, just broadly suggesting, if this holds, you have a number of exciting implications. Obviously, one of the controversies raging right now, and one of the reasons that I'm here, is the debate over the value of studying literature and majoring in the humanities. And I have to say, quite frankly, I don't think we need a study to show it. But what this preliminary research suggests is, at the very least, that core skills in liberal arts have immense cognitive complexity and provides us with tools to explore that neural complexity with rigor. Moreover, it may not be just the books we read, but the act of thinking rigorously about them in certain ways that's of value, integrating diverse cognitive processes across the brain. And I should add here, it didn't have to be Jane Austen. It could have been a romance novel that you were switching between for sure. And there's more. We're not just seeing close reading activating more blood flow than pleasure reading. Specific brain regions are going to have to wait for cross-group analysis and all sorts of things. But I want to just talk through this case study and an example brain image from our pilot to show why these results have been so interesting. So here, the red and the yellow in the example mark heightened activity for close reading, with the blue marking activity for pleasure. And so, here we see literary analysis activating unexpected areas of the brain, like the somatosensory cortex, used to process touch, place yourself spatially in the world, as well as the motor cortex, right, area dedicated to physical activity. But we also, right, as you can see heightened activity in blue, and this holds across an even larger range for a number of our subjects, and I can show you some images if you'd like. So if so, close reading is far from being simply a state of heightened attention to literature, with pleasure reading merely being like a lesser mode of cognition or focus, as in Showalter, she described it as active versus passive reading. And again, this is supporting what Suzanne was talking about the other day, or yesterday. Instead, each style of reading has its own cognitive demands and neural signatures, creating its own distinct patterns in the brain. Or to put this another way for translation, pleasure reading has its own demands, and close reading has its own pleasures. And in fact, the best case scenario for total brain activation comes, it seems, not from unremitting literary study, but from sustaining cognitive flexibility, or being able to switch between reading for pleasure and reading critically, which means that professors might have something to gain from putting the pencil down. So that was the first surprise. But I actually think the second is more interesting, and it has to do with literary essays. So to my surprise and delight, people are actually quoting specific lines from the novel by memory. And these are just some of the examples. There are only 3 examples from the total of 168 direct quotes from Mansfield Park that were made by these 18 subjects without being able to look back at the text. So humanist methods, in other words, are giving us extremely rich behavioral data, a written record of what people paid attention to, letting us see patterns where the story captured attention across the group, as well as acknowledge individual differences in attention, both between people and across the narrative as we go. And just to kind of go through this, as you can see from this pie chart also, an astonishing number of quotes, and I want to say this is already, at least to me, astonishing, coming from reading inside a scanner, a loud and relatively distracting scanner, are actually from the close reading sections. So they're doing it amazingly, something that's only reinforced when we look at the reading times, where they're in fact spending approximately twice as long when they're asked to close read. And we'll come back to these reading times later because it's where it gets really, really interesting. And there are some strong patterns as well in what gets quoted, attended to, and remembered in Mansfield Park. The different sections, as we remember, they're broken up into sections, a total of 32 of them. So this is an example of what happens when you actually look at where people are quoting from in this text across these different sections. And so clearly something is happening in chapter 2 in areas like 8, 9, 14, 20, 24, 25. Yeah. That is not in some of the others, right? 3, 11, 16, 20, 28. That is not drawing, receiving almost no attention or quoting from the literary PhDs. And so a student working on a completely different project came out with a graph about the same time as we got this quoting data. And which basically, that was mapping the objects across the chapter. And because there are in fact so few of them, Austin is very, very abstract. He happened to finish his graph at the same time, and it struck us, the similarities between the two of us, which basically just drew us towards two hypotheses that we're pursuing right now about what was it about the text that was capturing readers' attention. And our first, right, is that readers actually seem to be paying attention from these quotes to passages that are more concrete, i.e. contain more objects, appeals to the senses, and we mean this in a multi-sensory domain, as opposed to abstract. And two, that essay writers seem to be particularly drawn to insults, leading us to ask, what role does literary affect, especially representations of negative emotions, especially considering negative bias, have on the parts of the story that capture our interest, we attend to, and we remember? So, let's see, come back, yeah. So what we decided, fortunately, a study came out around this time by Breisbert, where in fact over 4,000 individuals rated over 40, probably around 40,000 English words on a scale of abstractness and concreteness on a scale of 1 to 5, with a number, 5 being the highest, most concrete, 1 being the most abstract. And so you can think, a really, really concrete word for most people that like almost everyone rates a 5 as a sled, turns out. And a really, really abstract turns out like a real 1 is something like essentialness. And what they did is basically then you have this unbelievably rich database of this. So we basically took our question, which was, okay, how concrete are these quotes that we're finding from the essays as compared to the chapter as a whole? And so we developed an online platform to run these words and phrases through this Breisbert, this 40,000 word system, isolated all the words that matched directly with Mansfield Park, thus eliminating the issue of paraphrase. And then we ran quotes in all 32 blocks of Mansfield Park, chapter 2, also through Breisbert. And as of 3 days ago, which is why this talk is a little bit rough, we found out this. People our quoting patterns are highly concrete in relationship to Mansfield Park as a whole. We're talking about a p-value of 0.01. Cohen's d is a relatively conservative measure. And so we have a very large effect size for an incredibly small subject group. And this means that this is a very powerful effect. And I want to just give you an example. So here's block 8, one of the more highly quoted sections. This highlights all the words that got quoted by all the different subjects as they went, right? And so you start to notice that even amidst sort of more abstract sections of this, they are picking out the words within it, right, that are more concrete. Across subjects, right? So I wanted to just do an example so you can sort of see this. So this is an example of what would happen is that we would take, this would be a quote, for example. Someone would quote something like this, getting entire whole sections correct about making artificial flowers or wasting gold paper. And this would be the kind of result that you would see in our database, just to give you a sample. But just also say as well, this extends far beyond that simple block. We have references not just to the least valued toys, the artificial flowers, the gold paper, the 2 sashes, but also, to the gooseberry tart. There's not many in the text. There's not many objects. There's a gooseberry tart, a sofa, a pug, right? And we get all of these quotes, principal rulers of Russia, attic stairs. People seem to be drawn over and over again to this. And the reason I found this so exciting was that Lisa Sunshine suggested earlier this morning that what underlies our intuitive choice of quotes for close reading in the classroom, by students, in our research, right? Go back, check your own quoting patterns, right? What do you choose to close read and quote from? Right, is its socio-cognitive complexity, the quality of its embedded states of mind to exercise theory of mind on. But what I'd add to that, and I absolutely agree, and what I'd add is that we may also be drawn at a still more basic level towards passages with increased concreteness in fiction. The sofas, the sashes, the pugs, and the gooseberry tarts of literature. And that doesn't mean we're all just talking about objects. We're not all doing thing theory. And it's certainly not true of the essays either. What I've seen from the essays, which I think is the most exciting, is that students often use these more concrete objects and actions as anchors or springboards to analyze immensely complex patterns in the literature that range from, class dynamics to Austen's depictions of Fanny's mental states, from spatial metaphorics to structures of negation and irony, and they're noticing things down to semicolon structure and able to pick up on minute details about capitalization around that. So they really are doing this. And in this particular case, right, the pug grounds a discussion of Fanny's larger objectification, turning a moment where the heroine's called an interesting object to discuss, right, Austen's use of her as an object lesson in class analysis. And of course, this was helpful for me as an object of interest. So I'll give you a little bit of the last. I'm going to run through this a little bit faster. How am I doing on time? Anyone? No? This is the final bit. This is possibly the most confusing, but just to, again, see the ways that this humanistic data that you can gather can really add richness to a scientific study. As it turns out, so I talked about how, right, each of these groups is flipping between close reading and pleasure reading. Well, one group, the evens, right, does it in green, red, pleasure, right? And we randomize it. So as it turns out, if you look at reading times, the amount of time that the individuals spent pleasure reading a passage actually predicts the likelihood that the other group is going to quote from that section, which suggests that even when they're pleasure reading, right, they're still lingering over something, right? There's still something that's capturing attention there. And this will be supplemented with when we get the eye tracking data, but this is a fascinating and I think really unexpected result. And again, as I said, our final analysis is still in progress. These are some of the regions of interest that we have on tap, but also that activity, the quoting is correlated with brain activation as well, as far as we can tell thus far. So we'll see what happens. And so this sort of leads me to the final bit, that the quotes don't just reveal patterns in group attention, right? They actually also help us analyze something that's very difficult in neuroscience, and it brings us towards the question of individual differences, and giving us a richer hold on that. And so one that models, I think, in fact, the interplay I see, ideally, between scientific and humanistic models, and in fact returns us to Jane Austen. So Jane Austen was deeply interested in attention, particularly in the different degrees of focus one could bring to a book. As early as 1792, in her early work, Catherine of the Bower, we find the 16-year-old Austen comparing the novel's heroine, a, quote, great reader of long novels who remembers precise details about plot and scenery, to her friend, her more flirtatious friend, Camilla Stanley, a young woman who spent more of her attention on suitors and hats, and thus, quote unquote, missed it all, complaining of her friend's favorite novel, "It is so long." By Pride and Prejudice, Austin has begun crafting complex webs of such contrasts, what Alex Wallach calls character systems, framed around comparing characters' habits of attention. So Mr. Bennett, right, is reading regardless of the time, while Lydia, right, has an attention span of half a minute. Mary, deep in the study of human nature, and Thorough Base, full, novelist chock full of such comparisons. And actually, Persuasion, the novel we used for the pilot, and we started with chapter 1, opens with a distinctive scene of absorption that highlights this kind of difference in attention to reading. We find Sir Walter Bennett lost in the baronetage, rapidly reading the story of his ancestry. And as we're reaching the end of the talk and likely the end of your attention span, I'm not going to read it all, but it basically talks about how he was a man who for his own amusement never took up any book but the baronetage, where he found occupation for an idle hour, consolation in a distressed one, and could read his own history with an interest that never failed. But Austin quickly moves from this to a description of his daughter, who turns out, Elizabeth, who can now scarcely bear it, in particular due to a quote-unquote marital disappointment which that book must ever present a remembrance of. And thinking about this first historically in Austin and then in our fMRI study of Austin drew my attention back to what I think is perhaps the most interesting aspect of fMRI, the similarities and differences in individual attention. As her contrast of Walter and Elizabeth reminds us, character matters. Patterns of attention may be shared cognitively, narratively, and socially, but they also rely on a profoundly personal dynamic of preference, experience, and taste. And so for our literary fMRI, the ability to link patterns in the final essays with the data yielded by the brain scans and eye tracking down the line promised to offer new insights, not only into the unique narrative patterns across the group that seem to sort of foreground or draw literary attention across this group, but also into this fundamentally individual aspect of literary reading. And so, you know, I'll say again, like a number of subjects, for example, were drawn to moments, to go back to the affect, where the recently adopted heroine, Fanny Price, is derided by her rich relatives for her supposedly poor intelligence and education. So the essayist at top recalls a specific section where Fanny is described as ignorant when sent against her cousin's quote-unquote accomplishments. Another in the bottom notes the scene, right, where Lady Bertram says Fanny is stupid, but must take more pains, comparing the girl to her pug. And again, this is where the essayist goes more in detail about the fetching and the carrying and this larger system of comparisons in this text. Other patterns, however, are unique. The first subject later focused in particular on the Bertram children playing with artificial flowers. The second on Austin's use of sibilant words in describing Fanny's naval-minded brother, sea, sister, sailor, serious. Turns out she's absolutely right. There's about 20 cases of that assonance in that particular block. As this reminds us then, though each reader may have shared patterns in eye tracking and brain activation, each two will be distinct, and none will be exactly the same. And as we're gathering all this information about blood flow and brain regions and saccades, we will also be gathering these individual idiosyncrasies, dynamics for literary attention that are shaped, like those of Austin's characters, by experience, tracing the line between reading with disappointment and with an interest that never fails, a project or preliminary mapping that will require creative and unprecedented integrations of fMRI and eye tracking, qualitative and quantitative data, and tools from literature, digital humanities, and cognitive linguistics. Literary neuroscience is just emerging as a field, and I think what's most exciting lies ahead. I've clearly not had any time to talk about the poetry study. I'll just show you that. Look, it exists. I can talk more about it in Q&A. But basically, you know, what I hope this reminds us, and this ability to actually think about the individuals, is that literary neuroscience can be a field committed not to quantitative reduction, but to ever-expanding complexity, to dynamic mappings of aesthetics and of the mind and of narrative, and that this can be a field that in fact can be deeply interested, like persuasion, in personal differences, in differences that extend from fMRI to eye tracking to the individual structure of the brain itself. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and thank our unique-brained literary subjects, and thanks to my students who are here as well. Appreciate it.